You know, the symposium started as an imagination already about 1.5 years ago. And it's a little bit of an adventure trip that we're going to take together. And nobody knows where we're going to end up. But we are blessed that out of the work of Camp Hill, we have so many friends. And you see 4 of them here tonight, sitting on the stage, but there are more out here, who are going to accompany us on this trip. Now, Beaver Run could tell a slightly different version. I'm going to tell a very simplified version of Camp Hill Village, Copac, 50 years ago. In principle, Camp Hill in North America started with a handful of immigrants, 70 acres, an old farmhouse, which they named the White House until they found out that that name's already occupied. Yeah. A sort of garage with an apartment above it somehow, and a big red barn, which you can still see in Copac, and $5,000 in the bank, which in 1961 was considerably more money than it is today, but also not a whole lot of money to start with. And then they had 2 other things. They had an incredible amount of social need that they were willing to respond to, and they had a vision of how to respond to it. And that was actually the start of Camp Hill's work in North America. 50 years later, we have communities on the West Coast, in the center of the continent, here on the East Coast. The association email tells me, though, that even in this enlightened country, which in its care for the developmentally disabled is light years ahead of some other countries on earth, do you know what? From the need and the questions that come towards Camp Hill, if we had the resources, there would be a new Camp Hill community starting in the United States every month. There is so much need. And one of the questions in our care for the land, in our care for people, in our care of how we create economic situations, how we live and work together, coming towards us, and these questions are what put together the guest list that you will see in the course of these days, because we need to network. We need to reach out, work with other organizations, and work with them in a much stronger way than we've done until now. And now I'm going to tell you why. On October 9th, 1918, in Zurich, Rudolf Steiner held a lecture. And he decided, I guess, that he was going to develop a vision out of his spiritual insight as to what we would be facing today. And he speaks very clearly in this lecture of what will be present at the start of the new millennium. And what he describes there, he spoke about 93 years ago. And 2011, measured on a millennium, we are at the start of the new millennium. And there are certain things that he said would happen at the start of this new millennium. He said that through spiritual activity, 3 ideals would begin to become active by the start of the new millennium in human souls. And I'm going to quote those 3 ideals to you. The first one is, "In time to come, no human being shall find peace in the enjoyment of happiness if others around him are unhappy. An impulse of absolute brotherliness, making all of humanity one, will govern social life." He said this impulse will develop in human souls. The second one was, "In future, every human being shall see a hidden divine principle in every other human being. Not think there might be one, see. And the third one is, a third objective is to enable human beings to reach the spirit through thinking, crossing the abyss and experiencing the reality of the spirit in their thinking. So, in 1918, he said that by the turn of the century into the new millennium, these impulses would start to develop in human souls. If you think back of all the different movements and things that have grown up, Doctors Without Borders, Greenpeace, wherever you look, you can see this is true. If you look at all the social initiatives that have developed in the last 50 years and are growing today, you can see this absolute brotherliness principle is beginning to awaken in human souls. Now, that's all good news, right? I mean, those are all pretty good things to have, if you think about it. That's, you know, we could go with that. We could go home now and just say, okay, that's going to happen. Yeah? But there is a catch, as he describes it. And the catch is, if human souls do not become aware of these impulses, then every one of these impulses will develop a shadow side. And the shadow side for the first impulse of brotherliness is danger would threaten from certain instinctive perceptions that would above all make people go against brotherliness on earth rather than develop brotherliness. This would be a matter of instinct. In relationship to the second ideal, where every human being shall see a hidden divine principle in every other human being, the shadow side, if it's not recognized, would be everything connected with medicine will make great advances in the materialistic sense. Pathological changes will be called normal, for people will find this pleases them. They will be able to arrange matters entirely to suit their egotistical purposes. In relationship to the third objective, being able to cross the abyss and experience the reality of the Spirit, humanity will get to know specific powers which enable them to unleash tremendous mechanical forces. Well, who's been reading the news? Who's been reading the news? What is happening in Japan? What is happening in Japan 66 years after the atomic bomb was dropped there? And now we have this situation there. So we are at the beginning of this millennium. And we can see these three ideals growing in humanity on many, many corners. But we can also see all three of the shadow sides growing on every corner. It's all there, right now. That's where we live. And that is where Camp Hill is at this crossroads of its 50th anniversary and needing to look forward and to see where do we connect with others that can help to grow the good, that can help to realize that these three ideals can bear fruit for mankind. That is where we're standing at today, and I'm hoping that our little symposium can be one little humble step on that path. And so I want to thank you all for being here and for being willing to not know what's going to happen, but to say, we're going to do this together. Because that is already the start of such a movement. Now, Rudolf Steiner also gave us a little bit of help on this at the end of the lecture. And I would like to put that in here now. He closes the lecture with a very interesting thought. We can get into the habit of being alert. Already not always that easy, you know, to be alert. We can get into the habit of being alert. We can pay heed to many things. We can make a start now and find that basically not a day passes without a miracle happening in our life. Not a day passes without a miracle happening in our life. And that's a little bit what I'm hoping for this week, is that we pull off a few little human miracles together. And then I think our time will have been well spent. Now, I'm going to stop here because now I have the joy to introduce our speakers to you and to hear what they are bringing from their perspective of the world to add in to where we are now. So, thank you. I would first like to introduce Dan McCannon. Dan McCannon is an old, he doesn't look that old, but a very long time friend of Camp Hill's. His connection starts out with Camp Hill Village, Minnesota. At that time, he was teaching on the university out there. He is in the meantime teaching on the University of Harvard and teaching theology, and has written, among other things, a most amazing book called Touching the World, where he compares the work of Camp Hill to the work of the Catholic Workers' Movement in an incredibly fine and sensitive way. So when we started thinking about this symposium, Dan's was one of the first names on our list, and I'm glad to say he's here today.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for inviting me. It's really a great, great joy to share this time with all of you. 50th anniversaries don't come easily to intentional community movements, and all of you who are Camp Hillers can take a great deal of pride in the many flowers that have bloomed from the seeds that were planted at Copake and Beaver Run in the early 1960s. I'm really excited that you've planned this symposium to look forward and outward at all the ways that Camp Hill might share its gifts in the century that is unfolding. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. Tonight, as you'll see on the handout, I'd like to reflect on three really big challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. First is the challenge of concentrated power, the ways in which large institutions prevent individuals, families, workplaces, and neighborhoods from shaping our own lives. Second is the challenge of unequal progress, the fact that technological advances that have created unimaginable wealth for a few have left billions still without adequate food, housing, or health care in every corner of the globe. And third is the challenge of ecological collapse, our alienation from the rhythms of Mother Earth, which threatens our own survival and that of the creatures with whom we share the planet. In a few minutes, I'll reflect on these challenges in four ways. First, I'll identify a moment in history when each challenge became kind of a priority item for large numbers of people. Second, I'll describe how the challenge confronts us today. Third, I'll relate each to Rudolf Steiner's vision of a threefold social order. And finally, I'll suggest some ways that Camp Hill can and does help humanity face the challenge. Before I do any of that, though, I'd like to tell a little bit more about what I'm bringing to the conversation. For the past 30 years, since I was a kid, I've approached these kinds of challenges from the perspective of the left. I began calling myself a pacifist when I realized my parents were professionally involved in the Reagan-era military buildup. Awareness of the violence and repression faced by ordinary people in Central America turned me into a socialist. Soon I embraced the struggles against racism, against sexism, against homophobia as well. I felt my own privileges as a professional class white man to be deeply unjust and wanted to join others in building a better society. And so now, as a historian of American religion, I try to tell the stories of how communities of faith have supported the kind of leftist causes that I cherish. My first encounter with Camp Hill grew out of that vocation. Many leftist traditions have included practices of intentional community. By living in small cooperative communities, activists and other causes experience now the good society they dream of building on a larger scale in the future. When I began my teaching career in Minnesota, I was eager to write a book telling that story. And so I reached out to the intentional communities in my neighborhood and soon found myself spending a month each summer with Camp Hill Village, Minnesota. Camp Hill challenged a lot of the presuppositions that I brought to that project. The people that I met in Minnesota and at other Camp Hills, many of you that I met in the course of that research, seemed to have the same goals as my comrades on the left. But the methods were different. Camp Hillers were not as interested as others that I knew in protesting or criticizing the rest of society. They were more interested in going about your own healing work. And the spiritual assumptions were different from those of the people with whom I went to church. Most leftists, even religious leftists, even my theology professors at Harvard and Vanderbilt and Chicago, worry that too much spirit talk will distract attention away from the material needs of people who are suffering. Rather than pie-in-the-sky spirituality, they want an embodied faith that seeks a better society now. So I was surprised initially to see the ways that Camp Hillers take distinctions of body, soul, spirit seriously. You in Camp Hill assume that one cannot build a better society without attending and honoring that threefold structure of the human person. So I wondered if there was something that leftists like me could learn from that point of view. And in my historical work, I soon found that those kinds of spiritualities kept showing up in unexpected places in the history of the left. Among theosophists who worked against British imperialism, among New Thought proponents who joined the Socialist Party alongside more conventional Marxists in the early 20th century, among spiritualists who were stalwarts of socialism and feminism in the 19th century. So I wondered how a deeper understanding of all these spiritualities might challenge the assumption that the left is an outgrowth of scientific materialism. But those questions stayed on the back burner while I wrote Touching the World, and they stayed on the back burner while I wrote my new larger book tracing the history of religion and the left in the United States. And I've got flyers for that new book that'll be available later on. Finally, with that project done, I'm in the place where I'm really turning to the front of my attention to those back burner questions about creative interchange between anthroposophical and other forms of alternate spirituality and the left as conventionally understood. So this symposium is one of my first chances to ask, what do anthroposophy and related traditions have to teach the left, and what do they have to learn from the left? And I'll be reflecting on my three big challenges in a way that frames how I'm kind of getting at that question. Another frame that I find useful is the slogan of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. I sometimes prefer liberty, equality, solidarity. As many of you know, Rudolf Steiner saw these values as each applicable to a different sphere of social life. Liberty was the watchword in cultural and spiritual affairs. Equality governs the democratic sphere of rights, and solidarity is the true basis of economic life. In my own work, I've used liberty, equality, solidarity as a convenient shorthand for the revolutionary vision of 1776 and 1789 that leftists have always wanted to extend further. At this point in my personal spiritual evolution, I'm committed to the slogan, the way it's understood by leftists, and intrigued by the slogan, the way it's understood by Rudolf Steiner. So while I'll be alluding to the threefold social order tonight, I don't claim any expertise. And all of you, I hope, will educate me over the course of the next few days about the ways in which my presentation aligns or departs from Steiner's. So now I come back to my three challenges. The challenge of concentrated power, of tyranny, of oppression, came to the forefront of the Western consciousness in the years just before the turn of the 19th century. People in the English and Spanish colonies challenged the authority of distant European powers. Europeans challenged the divine right of kings. The founders of the United States, worried that tyranny might reassert itself here, allowed religious and political institutions to develop in freedom from one another. A global uprising against slavery exposed tyrannical power in the household and plantation, allowing people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman to teach women to fight for their own equality, and others to imagine ways in which social harmony might be achieved without state violence. From the perspective of the threefold social order, that struggle against concentrated power took place largely in the middle sphere of political life. In another sense, the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century were doing the unfinished business of the Protestant Reformation. The reformers had asserted spiritual freedom against the dogmatic authority of the church. But when the church made common cause with monarchs, it became clear that spiritual freedom at that level couldn't be achieved without social equality at the level of politics. So the revolutions that challenged monarchs and slaveholders were often modeled on earlier struggles against dogmatic religion and hierarchical churches, sometimes with tragic results for ordinary people who were deeply devoted to the sacraments and festivals of Catholicism. Partly because of those tragedies, that struggle against concentrated power was never finished. Political democracy is still a work in progress for us. Billions of people in China and the Muslim world have no voice in the governments that rule them. Dozens of governments in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia are democratically elected but lack real power to shape the interests of their people because of the imperial authority of Western governments and corporations. And here in the U.S., democracy is undermined by the new concentrated power of the corporation, monstrously treated by our courts as if it were the person with flesh and blood. While leftists typically fight against concentrated power in all those forms, Campbell offers another response. It practices dispersed power, and it practices it well. Campbell offers an example of how authority can be shared within a village and of how villages might organize society better than states and corporations. In your practice of consensus, you trust one another to make good decisions even when you're not personally involved. At least most of the time I think you do. Maybe some of you will correct me on that as well.
We have a list.
And so you sidestep one of the great tragedies of mistrust in American politics today. Those who fear the power of corporations seek to empower government so it can restrain corporations and provoke the opposition of those who fear government even more. But Campbell's achievements are too little known beyond your borders. And that's tragic because many people are familiar with the short, contentious histories of other communal movements, from Brook Farm to the hippie communes of the 1960s. The idea that utopias never work is still out there, preventing people from imagining alternatives to the state and the corporation. So Campbell's task is to tell its story in a way that helps others imagine a new social future. The second challenge to humanity today is that of unequal progress. Just as movements arose to fight concentrated power before and after the year 1800, so around the turn of the 20th century it became clear that many were being excluded from progress. Industrialism had expanded the human capacity to provide goods and services, but workers were treated as cogs in the machine rather than beneficiaries. When material progress was most fully realized, wrote journalist Henry George in his book Progress and Poverty, there was still, especially there, where the progress was the greatest, there was the greatest struggle for existence between rich and poor. Outrage at that contradiction led to the rise of various forms of socialism and to struggles against imperialism and racism. People who had been pushed to the margins claimed their own power as class-conscious workers, as proponents of black power later on, as young India in the Gandhian struggle. Their efforts led to reform in some places and revolution in others. And just as the political revolutions of the 18th century took up the unfinished business of the Reformation, so the socialist revolutions of the 20th took up the unfinished work of democracy. Socialists realized that the promise of equality in the political sphere was hollow unless workers enjoyed greater solidarity in the material, economic sphere. After all, who has time to engage in politics when she's struggling to put food on the table? So we see that transformation in each of Steiner's spheres has implications for the others. The Protestant Revolution in the spiritual sphere led to the democratic revolution in politics and on to socialist revolutions in economics. In principle, many early 20th century socialists shared Steiner's commitment to the autonomy of the spheres. Their dream, this is true even for Karl Marx, their dream was of a cooperative society in which local enterprises would be governed democratically. But most, following Marx, made the fateful compromise of enlisting state power to enforce cooperation. The result in the Soviet Union was Stalinist tyranny. In China, it was the madness of the Cultural Revolution. The impulse for equality took more benign form in the social welfare states of Europe and in the New Deal here in the United States. But the fact that people were using state power to generate equality made it easy for economic elites in their self-interest to portray the social welfare state as itself a new form of tyranny and pose a false choice between liberty and equality. And so, especially in the past 30 years, we've seen a steady diminution in the commitment to economic equality and cooperation. The collapse of Soviet communism, the remaking of Chinese communism as a new form of capitalism, scaling back of social welfare in Europe and the United States, with religious or racial minorities locked into the lower levels of the class hierarchy. At least here in the United States, inequality is back to the levels it was at in the 1870s. And once again, Camp Hill has something special to say here, because you've refused the false choice between equality and authentic diversity. Your communities embrace people who are, in one sense, very different one from the other. You've set yourselves the challenge of creating equal community in a context where some use language, some do not, where some move without assistance, some move with the help of others. And through these differences, you've deepened your respect for human commonalities. You've deepened our respect for the special needs we all have, the special need for a voice in community decision-making, the special need for assistance every day in meeting our material needs. To the extent that you affirm that all are villagers and all are co-workers, all are teachers and all are students, you light the path to a world in which differences are honored rather than exploited. At the same time, I would invite Camp Hillers to join colleagues on the left in engaging differences of class and race more directly. To the extent that some forms of Camp Hill life are open only or primarily to those with family wealth, the witness of solidarity is diminished. So I find it especially exciting to see Camp Hill working with projects like the Sophia Project, bringing the Camp Hill vision directly to bear on problems of poverty. I wonder, too, if it is possible to foster dialogue and partnership with initiatives that grow organically out of non-Western spiritual traditions, particularly the traditions of Native American communities and of African diasporic communities. My final challenge is the one most uniquely associated with the 21st century, the challenge of ecological collapse. Almost a century after Henry George warned against unequal progress, the first Earth Day marked the rise of the contemporary energetic environmental movement. Earth Day's organizers were concerned with pollution, with nuclear power, with accelerating extinction of species. Now all those challenges are folded together with the so present threat of climate change. I define the problem even more broadly. We've forgotten how to live with nature, how to keep rhythm with the cycles that surround us, even as we sing melodies of freedom. The problem of addiction to drugs and alcohol, to sugar and shopping, to unnecessary work, is part, I think, of the ecological crisis. So too is the challenge of information technologies that divide us from one another and from our deepest embodied desires. We've been so successful at using and exploiting all that surrounds us that we've forgotten that we are of the earth, happiest in harmony with nature. And so just as democracy takes up the unfinished work of the Reformation, and socialism takes up the unfinished work of democracy, so ecology takes up the unfinished work of socialism. We can't extend the material benefits of technology to 8 billion people unless we shift from an exploitative to a cooperative relationship with nature. The most remarkable feature of this transition, happening everywhere around us, is that it involves a return to spirit. The rise of ecology has coincided with a proliferation of spiritual movements and practices, and with the collapse of the old dogma so strong in academia that societies would inevitably secularize as they became more advanced. Environmentalists have learned deeply from spiritual traditions rooted in local ecosystems. They've revived the nature-based spirituality of pagan Europe, and they've renewed those strands of Christianity that find God not apart from, but in the midst of the natural world. And the spiritual wisdom of anthroposophy is a vital part of that rich mix. The heart of our ecological challenge is to reconnect with spirit, understood not as the opposite of matter, but as its inner life. For 50 years in the United States and 70 years worldwide, Camp Hill has shown how to do that. And once again, Camp Hill's approach intrigues me because it avoids the us versus them logic of the left. Many radical ecologists see nature threatened by humanity and stress the preservation of wild ecosystems. Camp Hill instead reminds human beings that we are part of nature, and thus stresses practices like sustainable agriculture. One of the stories that excites me most in the world today is that of community-supported agriculture. 13,000 farms in the United States have adopted some form of this model. But not very many of the people with shares in those farms realize how closely tied that history is to Camp Hill and biodynamic agriculture more generally. Perhaps it doesn't matter whether they know. For Camp Hill to claim credit would be to adopt a technological rather than an ecological model of change. We wouldn't want to say, Camp Hill made the CSA movement happen. But Camp Hill planted a few seeds that helped shift the whole social ecology in a positive direction. What does matter is that CSAs and natural food co-ops and all the other creative experiments that have grown up with Camp Hill continue to invite people to a deeper encounter with spirit. Think of it. There might be 500,000 CSA subscribers bringing a little bit of Camp Hill into their kitchens each week. Opening that box, asking, what can I make with broccoli and potatoes and this big bag of purslane? That was always the question I had to ask when I cooked lunch at Camp Hill, Minnesota, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. It's the fundamental question of ecology, and it's the fundamental question of spirituality. What can we make with these beautiful fields, with this life-giving creek, and with all of these people? It's the basic question of social equality and freedom from tyranny. What can we make with you, Richard? What can we make out of all of us? As long as we can answer questions like that, the future is bright and Camp Hill will remain our great teacher along the way. Thank you.
And he is very active in the nonprofit Seeds. And I believe that he has important things to tell us. And he has put a special emphasis on looking at sustainable infrastructure. Am I expressing that correctly, Barton? Yes? So with no further ado, I would like to thank you for being with us and being willing to share something of your thought processes and your work with us this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. It is a distinct honor to return here to the Camp Hill Village, having spent 2 summers here as a young engineering student, evaluating the feasibility of bringing a wastewater treatment process inspired by nature and under the very principles of the Camp Hill movement here in the Kimmerton Hills Village. And it was a transformative experience for me in many regards. But it was part of a much longer process of transformation. And I just want to share with you a little bit of the journey that I have taken. My journey starts out on a small biodynamic CSA, and which we have heard the wonders of what the CSA concept has done, and was really in large part born out of the CSA movement here in North America is really born out of this region. And for me, I developed a very deep appreciation for food and sustainable agriculture, but also the understanding and appreciation for alternative economic systems, and also the fabric of culture, the social fabric and cultural fabric that was possible, that was woven together as a result of bringing together that community of folks. And so from that, I juxtaposed that experience to the conventional agriculture that I saw around me, the environmental degradation, the erosion of soils, the impacts on our streams and groundwater. And I became inspired to pursue agricultural engineering and to combine together science, the hard science, as well as the appreciation for the biological sciences. And it was there that I became connected with the Center for Sustainability. And through that time, I became aware of many of the components that were really critical and vital to community health. And whether it be alternative medicine, whether it was intentional living, onto natural systems for water and wastewater treatment, and really providing our infrastructure from processes that were inspired by nature itself. And at that time, I was connected with the Camp Hill Kimberton Hills here, and after my engineering studies, became an intern here and studied under the guidance of Helen Zipperlin here. And she taught me things beyond just simply ecological design, but really to begin to appreciate elegance and art in design. And then gave me a little shove and pushed me off to Schumacher College in Devon, England, to study Goethean science and ecological design through the likes of John Todd and Nancy Jack Todd, David Orr, and begin to understand the ecological psychology, the ecological literacy that was really critical for a transformation in our communities, to begin to really begin to tap into the spiritual underpinnings of community health, or the ecological and spiritual underpinnings of community health. And at the same time, during that period, I became familiar, or I became associated with Dr. John Todd, and he soon became my advisor for my graduate studies at the University of Vermont. And it was there that I began to apply a more holistic approach of analysis, of engineering analysis, called life cycle assessment, which attempted to evaluate the entire life cycle of social and environmental impacts, but particularly environmental impacts. And I thought that this was the absolute cat's pajamas, that I was able to look at, to be able to compare and evaluate impacts of air, water, and soil, ecotoxicity, global climate change, water consumption, fossil fuel consumption, human health and cancer impacts, and be able to try to come together with a holistic analysis that provides us with one perfect environmental solution. And I burst out from the gates of academia full of wanderlust and vigor and wanting to make change in this world. And I left the bucolic hills of Vermont, where everyone seemed to speak the same language. Certainly we had environmental and social problems of our own, but that I really yearned for an opportunity to make change where it was desperately needed. And I moved to Pittsburgh, which was not a place I had ever expected to be. And there is a very vibrant and progressive community there that I have connected with. But it's also a place of racial segregation and socioeconomic inequality unlike I've experienced anywhere else. And certainly I haven't, there are more dire examples of it throughout the world. But becoming face to face with it in Pittsburgh, I soon realized, as I tried and tried again and again to apply these holistic and systems approaches, or I should say holistic analyses, but really coming at it from a reductionist approach, despite all of my holistic and Goethean mentorship that I had received throughout the years. I just was not getting anywhere, despite providing the proof time and time again of the socially, economically, and environmentally preferable option. We just weren't achieving any sort of transformational change. And so what I want to share with you tonight is just one of the tools, one of the concepts that I've become aware of in the last 2 years that helps me to synthesize the approach to enacting transformative change in our communities. And I'm just in the process of beginning to apply this. And I'm coming to you this evening not necessarily as an academic, but more as a practitioner. And the theory that I was introduced to is the theory of integral ecology, and some of you may be familiar with it. But it's based on integral theory, and it's a simple framework of looking at the interior, the exterior, the individual, and the collective. And if you think of 4 quadrants, we have the interior, individual, exterior, individual, interior, collective, and exterior, collective. And if we think about the way in which we develop understanding, and then that was really what I had begun to realize was that knowing something and being able to transfer that into action and transformation really requires multiple levels of understanding. And I was having difficulty addressing particularly the spiritual underpinnings of why of simply being human and being a human that can take action to address the issues of inequality, to address the issues of community health and environmental health. And so what I found in this theory of integral ecology was that by addressing this individual interior, which is really the terrain of experience and gaining knowledge by felt experience. And then we also have the terrain of behavior, which is the more objective, the objective knowing through observation on a personal level. And then in the collective interior, we have a knowing that we develop through mutual resonance and a mutual understanding. Again, it's a subjective type of knowing. And then as the collective exterior, we have the terrain of social or of systems analysis, and we really understand by sort of objective systematic analysis. And that's where I was spending so much of my time and so much of my focus, and felt that if I could provide people with that holistic systems perspective, that they would simply have the tools with which to make the appropriate decision and make the appropriate choice. But as I'm discovering, that's simply not enough. And where I'm finding the most traction, the most positive, both within my heart and with the expressions from the community members that I work with and I meet with, is when we're able to really reach each other on all 4 of those quadrants of the individual, interior, individual, exterior, collective, interior and exterior as well. And so in terms of that has manifested itself in my work in 2 ways at this point. One has been through the development of a conference or symposium, much like the one we're engaging in here this evening and this week. Been very active in bringing the Bioneers Conference to Pittsburgh and to Northern Michigan, where my organization is headquartered. And I don't know, perhaps some of you are familiar with it, but the Bioneers are essentially a group of folks who focus on, it's a conference that's focused on solutions that meet at the crossroads of ecological restoration, social justice, and really is about community health, but brings together a multitude of diverse disciplines. And they have, they really focus on positive solutions and groundbreaking solutions, but the conference itself, those lectures tend to be very intellectual, and it's simply not enough, and it hadn't been simply enough in order to really provide transformational change, and particularly as we were reaching out to the underprivileged, underserved, and black communities of Pittsburgh. We found that the ways in which we were able to really engage with folks in the black communities of Pittsburgh and was through art and music, and we were able to, by bringing them in on the terrain in which they were comfortable and in which they could contribute to the conference, with the black intellectuals that we had in our community, the conference organizers, we were able to achieve just an incredible experience in our community. And we started with, in the individual experience, we had the focus specifically on food and just simply providing and a nourishing and holistic meal in which was I mean, just the expressions from the children that we were working with, that in and of itself was profound for them to experience this new way of appreciating food and understanding where it came from, and then to see and to engage and from that frame and from that reference point, then be able to engage with these higher level intellectual concepts that were being broadcast through the speakers, really began to bridge that gap. And so we've just found a tremendous amount of positivity through that experience here in Pittsburgh, and then also through Pittsburgh, the other way in which this concept has manifested for myself has been through something as simple as rain gardens. I don't know how many of you are familiar with rain gardens, but basically it's a depression or a way of landscaping our urban or suburban or rural landscape in such a way that captures the runoff from our roofs, our sidewalks, our streets, and allows us to infiltrate and really restore the ecological function of our conventional landscapes in a very beautiful way. And working with rain gardens has, even though they're a very simple concept, has opened up a tremendous opportunity to connect with, for me personally, my spiritual connection with water, and to share that with others in a way that I have not been able to find elsewhere. And it's something that's so easy to, it's such a sort of grassroots and distributed type of process that allows us to perpetuate that that concept. And the way in which I applied the integral theory to rain gardens was that in terms of experience, we start out with, I start out actually with the systems analysis approach, and providing both the youth or landscape practitioners or community members that I'm working with the concept of, the simple concept of the watershed, and placing them within their watershed and understanding the complex dynamics that happen with the complex hydrologic dynamics that happen within our community in Pittsburgh, which is very similar to Philadelphia and many other areas throughout the region, we have a serious combined sewer overflow problem where simply 1/8 of an inch of rain will cause our sewers, we have combined stormwater and wastewater sewers, will cause them to overflow and dump raw sewage directly into the rivers. And so by going through this process of talking about rain gardens, we're able to really make that connection to our individual homes, individual communities and businesses to this broader ecological problem that our region faces. Then in the observation, the individual exterior observation, we really provide the opportunity for folks who have never had a chance to really appreciate or understand the properties of soil and the properties of water as it flows through an urban environment, and really begin to observe and appreciate. We just have very little connection to water in the cities in the way that folks who spend time in rural areas or in the wilderness get to really appreciate the flow of water flowing naturally. And so by going through this process of developing rain gardens, we really begin to develop a whole new appreciation for the flow of water. And in the cultural, the cultural terrain of the interior, the interior collective, we are able to, rain gardens are great events. They're much like a mini barn raising in many ways. They provide a tremendous opportunity as community volunteer events. And so we've just seen this great overlapping of communities, of socioeconomic groups working together on these projects. And really, they are great opportunities to engage youth. And so applying those three together with the final one, which is to talk about the felt experience and connecting with the water itself to really get that spiritual sense as you watch, as you're able to sit there and watch water flowing into these rain gardens and just appreciating the entire process. It's in an urban environment, the ability for an individual or a small group of folks to transform the landscape and really connect on all of these levels is a rare thing. And it can be done through community gardens. It can be done through several other projects, but I've really found a unique application in rain gardens. And so what I haven't been able to do is take the next step to apply that at the professional level where I am working with communities to address large community-wide climate change and energy issues. And one of the things I'm still struggling with is how to really bring this whole process together to work with communities at that level. And one of the things I will be looking forward to getting through this experience is working with you and talking with you about your experiences with concepts similar to integral ecology, because as for me, it wasn't a new, the philosophy behind it and the intention behind it was nothing new for me, but being able to frame it in such a way was really important in order to make, to address body, mind, and spirit in each of the projects that I have been working on. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I am deeply delighted to be here and look forward to speaking and working and sharing with you the rest of the week. Thank you.
Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you, for the next contribution, Viva Kite. And I cannot even begin to list her achievements. It is a long list. I'm going to go to the top of the little biography that you have in your book and to the bottom, because I think that will give you the most interesting things and you'll have to fill in all the rest in conversation with her over the next few days. Eva is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University. And from there, if you look at your book, it just goes on. Her achievements. I am particularly interested to know that she is working on a book tentatively entitled, now this really should get your mouth watering, yeah? A quest for a humbler philosophy, thinking about disabled minds and things that matter. I can guarantee you this book will be in our circles a bestseller. When it comes to publication, this will be a bestseller. Eva comes from a particular personal standpoint also, having a challenging child. And combining that with her philosophical work puts her in a very unique position to speak to us this evening. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this. I have an intellectual and a very personal interest in the work that you do here. And I really look forward to these 4 days. I even dragged my husband along. I didn't have to drag him. He was happy to come because we both are deeply involved in finding ways to improve the lives of all by improving the lives of some of the most vulnerable people amongst us. And I think that's what you succeed in doing here, and that's what my quest for humbler philosophy is about. I apologize for all of this technological mess, but you'll see why, and I hope it is worth it. I am, in fact, a philosopher, and when I started doing my philosophy, I was just starting out in motherhood. There's a passage in a Washington Post editorial page. One parent of a child with severe disabilities wrote that having a child with a severe disability made of every parent a philosopher. So, what if you're already a philosopher and are raising a child with multiple and severe disabilities, including severe cognitive disabilities? Well, I think what it makes is a humbler philosopher. And when I talk about my daughter, I like to bring her into the room. That's her having a nice smooch with her mom. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the beginning of the book. It lay fallow in my mind as I pursued a philosophical career in mainstream philosophy. How can one repeatedly read and teach texts that give reason pride of place in the pantheon of human capabilities, when each day I interacted with a wonderful human being who displayed no indisputable evidence of a rational capacity? How can one view language as the very mark of humanity when this same daughter can speak not a word? Whoops, sorry about that. There we go, back to mom and Sesha, okay. How can one read about justice as the consequence of reciprocal relationships and contractual agreements when one's own child is unable and will apparently never be able to participate in reciprocal contractual agreements? My daughter gave lie to most of my professed philosophical beliefs. Were they merely dogmas? Were these merely dogmas I accepted? Could they be made compatible with the lived reality of the existence of a beloved person such as my daughter. I knew I would have to confront this dissonance at some point in my life. It might change my relationship to philosophy. This discord could not, however, change my relationship to my daughter. That was my fixed point of reference, my Archimedean point. If Western philosophy has rested on any certain foundation, it's been on the importance of the capacity for reason, for all that is human. Now, I don't know if my daughter can reason. I know that certain causal sequences are ones she just can't seem to get. As she can't speak, as she moves around in a wheelchair only pushed by someone else, and seems to be unable to do very little with her hands, her skills as an agent are not clear. Thus, her ability to follow directions are limited, and our ability to discover what she understands can be inferential at best. While I can't say that she lacks the power to reason altogether, I can't assume this ability. The possession of reason is not only how philosophers have generally characterized what makes us human, right? This you read in philosopher after philosopher. It's also the very ground, as far as philosophers are concerned, of what is our quintessential distinctive end. Does it even then make sense to examine philosophical questions in the light of someone who might not even be able to reason poorly, but perhaps might not be able to reason at all? So these were questions that would float around in my head. Sesha has taught me that a profound love of another can change one's values and priorities. I didn't stop loving wisdom, but Sesha taught me a different sort of wisdom. Can those lessons be brought under the mantle of philosophy? So I placed these discordant notes on a back burner of my mind. I was a young philosopher then. I had yet to get tenure. It was labeled Future Philosophical Project, Sesha. Yeah. One of the first of these is the question, the issue of humanity, the issue of, as philosophers talk about it, personhood. Because philosophers will talk not just about what it is to be human, but what it is to be a person. A person, yeah. To do this, to try to question philosophy in light of the challenges that my daughter brought to me, really has meant using philosophy against itself, to engage really in, I think, a very deep critique of philosophy itself. Philosophical definitions of humanity or personhood, for the most part, have been defined in a way that excludes or admits those with severe intellectual disabilities. So how is one to challenge this exclusion within philosophical discourse? How is one to challenge this, without the requisite concepts? We don't even have the concepts at hand to question this. And then there's the question of the empirical, because most philosophers have had no contact with people who are not very much like themselves. And what is actually even more upsetting sometimes than to see the exclusion of any discussion of people with disabilities, and especially intellectual disabilities in philosophy, is to see the way they are in fact used. And one example of this is by a very prominent contemporary philosopher named Peter Singer. Now, some of you might know that name. It's kind of notorious in the disability community. But Peter Singer is a highly moral individual. And he has made a lot of important moral contributions. He has raised the issue of global poverty. He has raised the question of our cruelty to animals. These are all genuine contributions. But here is a question in which he has a very serious blind spot. And here is what his reasoning is. The blind spot is connected, actually, with his advocacy for another very important moral issue, and that is the way in which we treat animals. And his argument has been that by claiming that all human beings are equal, we are implicitly saying that all human beings are superior to all non-human beings. And he asks, what's the ground for this? And he points to a small population of those people with diminished intellectual capacities, certain cognitive capacities, as a reason not to take the idea that all humans are equal seriously. And to say that some human beings only have the capacities, they have the same capacities as non-human animals. And therefore, to give all humans a moral priority, he says, is speciesism. That is to say, it's a kind of prejudice that we have toward our own species that's no more warranted than the prejudice of one race for its own members of that race. And so this class of human beings who are not at the same intellectual, do not have certain intellectual capacities, certain psychological capacities that other human beings have. Those humans are not what he calls persons. And persons are the category of beings that have a very special moral status. So the special moral status that we usually attribute to human beings, Peter Singer wants to say, belongs to those individuals with certain kinds of cognitive capacities, whether they be human or not. And all the others have a different moral status. A different moral status, we shouldn't treat them badly. In fact, that's what his whole argument's about, that we shouldn't treat animals badly. But it winds up putting people, like some of the people here perhaps, but certainly someone like my daughter, into a kind of moral limbo. Now, in trying to bring together the questions of philosophy and the questions of cognitive disabilities, I, along with another participant at this conference, Sophia Wong, helped to organize a conference at Stony Brook that brought people like Peter Singer together with a lot of other philosophers to talk about some of these issues. And Peter Singer made the argument that he's been making for years and years and years and years. And at the end of his talk, I was chairing the session, and he had mentioned at that session that he brings his students to the neonatal portion of Rutgers Hospital to see, what terrible lives these, impaired infants are going to lead. And I said, so Peter Singer engages in empirical investigation. Good. I'll ask him to come to where my daughter lives. So, I'm going to give you a little clip. I want you to see some of the people you're talking about. Well, one second, just, you bring your students to the neonatal unit. I just like equal time for the Center for Discovery. That's, I think, all I'm going to say, because I'll talk too much.
No, I don't want you to stop, because I'd like you to tell me what it is, just in terms of the argument that I presented, what it is that I would see there that would challenge the argument that I presented.
What he said is, you'll have to tell me what, given the argument I've presented, I'm going to learn there. Here I've invited him to go and meet some of the people he's talking about, and he's saying to me, well, what am I going to learn there? Yes, oh my gosh. You see why we need a humbler philosophy. Okay, so another philosopher named Jeff McMahon, who does bioethics, has written a very well-received book, 500-page book called The Ethics of Killing. 100 pages of that book is about people with severe, I think he calls it mental retardation in there, severe mental retardation. 100 pages of a 500-page book. Not one reference on anything having to do with mental retardation. Okay? Not one reference. Okay. So he was present at the conference, and he was making a similar argument to Singer's. I challenged him and Singer on the comparison of the meaning of the claim that a non-human animal has the same cognitive capacities as a human being with intellectual disabilities. When they say, you've heard these kinds of things, right? A person, an adult with mental disabilities, is said to have the cognitive capacities of a 3-month-old or a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old or whatever, which I want to challenge too. I mean, what does that mean? How can you? They may have some of the. They may not be able to have certain kinds of things that they can do that are any more advanced than that of a 6-year-old or a 6-month-old, but that doesn't mean that their understanding is at that level, right? I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about cognitive capacities? Now you tell me that a person with severe cognitive disabilities has the same cognitive capacities as a dog. Well, wait a minute, a dog is living a completely different life, needs completely different skills. What does it mean to say that they have the same cognitive capacities? What kind of scale is this? So I was challenging them in this, and I was saying I really don't understand the claim. It's not at all clear to me what it means, okay? So McMahon puts up a list of properties, and he calls these the radically cognitively impaired individual, because he didn't realize when he was writing the book that severe mental retardation was actually a clinical term. And that what he was saying about these people were actually a group of people that were identified with a clinical label. He didn't even know that, okay? But he's writing a book published by Oxford University Press about this, okay? So he puts up this list, the claim that the radically cognitively impaired individual has no capacity for self-consciousness, while the chimpanzee has some, okay? Has no capacity for understanding words or signs, while the chimpanzee has some, has no capacity for empathy, while the chimpanzee has some, has no capacity for reasoning about means and ends, while the chimpanzee has some, and so on for virtually all psychological capacities. Well, of course, we know that a lot of that is just false, right? But even if it weren't false, okay, is that going to define for us what it is to be a human? Is that list going to define for us what it is to be human? No? I mean, it's said that people with autism lack empathy. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't really know. But if they don't, does that mean we kick them out of the human community? We kick them out of the community of persons, moral persons? So, this is the next interchange, okay? So, at the question and answer period, Singer got up to ask the question, and here is the exchange that I want to show you. I hope we can get this as loud as possible.
You've said a couple of times, and you said it just again in response to the last question, that you think that Jeff doesn't have the empirical stuff right, and you also said that in response to my comparison between humans and non-human animals. And you put up Jeff's comments about, well, if we talk about self-awareness, then a chimpanzee is superior to some severely or radically cognitively limited humans. If we talk about capacity to use signs and so on and so forth. But you then said, well, but we can't just wave a hand and say, and so on, because there's so much more to what it is to be human. You've said that a couple of times, so I'm just wanting to ask you, well, can you tell us some of these morally significant psychological capacities in which you think that human beings, and let's talk about real ones, so the ones who are profoundly mentally retarded, if we use that term, in which they are superior to, you sort of said, well, maybe chimpanzees and great apes are different, so let's say in which they are superior to pigs or dogs or animals of that sort, right? It's a factual question. You can't just shake your head. You have to put up, I would say, or stop saying that.
You know, Peter, you said when I made that grunt, I guess, and you asked me, you know, how is Sesha different than a, what did you say, pig? And you said, well, it's a factual question, you know, put up or shut up. The first thing I have to do when you ask me that question is I have to get over, and I'm saying this to a very large audience, it's not the sort of thing I normally say to a very large audience, but I have to, in order to even answer, try to answer that question for you, I have to get over a feeling of nausea. It's not that I'm not able to answer it intellectually. It's that I can't even get to the point emotionally where I can answer that question. Most of the time. You know, when I say you can't just wave your hand and say, and so on, it's because there is so much to being human. There's the touch. There's the feel. There's the hug. There's the smile. There's the I don't know. There are so many ways of interacting. I don't think you need philosophy for this. You need a very good writer for this. And this is why I just reject this whole idea that you base moral standing on a list of cognitive capacities or psychological capacities or any kind of capacities. Because what it is to be human is not a bundle of capacities. It's a way that you are. It's a way you are in the world. It is a way you are with another. And I could adore my pig. I could dote on my pig. It would be something entirely different. And if you can't get that, if you can't understand that, then I'm not sure exactly what it is that you want to hear from me that I could tell you. I mean, I'll keep trying, because I think this is a very important conversation to have. And I have this conversation, I have to say, it's at great psychological cost. But I think it's important to have. And it's why I wanted to have this conference.
Let me say something on behalf. Say something on behalf of Peter's point of view here, and that is that Peter has not said anything to deny the significance of a mother's relation to her own child. Nothing, as far as I can tell. The question here is a question about what moral demands there are on other people. And the fact that you, Eva, have a relation with your daughter doesn't necessarily give other people the same reason, same set of reasons that you have to respond to your daughter in certain ways and to treat your daughter in certain ways. The question is, what is it about people like your daughter that makes demands, moral demands on other people that non-human animals can't make on any of us? That's the question that Peter is asking. He's not denying that you have a special relation to your daughter and that is very significant for you in your life, significant for her, and so on, and that's true of many other people. Or again, get you to look at George Pitcher's book or many other books.
I've read it.
Okay.
It's a very good book.
That also does indicate that these relations, some attenuated version of these relations, I wouldn't claim, and I'm sure that George Pitcher wouldn't claim that his relation to his dogs was as deep or significant or as objectively important as your relation to your daughter. Nobody's saying that. I will also say, though, that well, no, I won't. I was going to say something like, Peter and I didn't come here to hurt anybody's feelings. We're here to try to understand things better. I think that Peter and I engage in a fair amount of voluntary self-censorship. We're trying very hard not to say anything offensive, something hurtful. I'm profoundly averse to making people miserable.
one word. I know you're not trying to hurt anyone's feelings. I know Peter isn't trying to hurt anyone's feelings. That's not what it's about. You know, for me, it's not what I'm experiencing. It's what your writings might mean for public policy. That's what concerns me. And that's not just about my daughter. So I'm trying to think of what do I say? What do I say? You know, what's more that makes us human? So I come up with the first things I can think. You know. Touch. What? Touch. Yes. Okay. Kiss. A hug. A smile. A way what I say and what is really at the heart of what I want to say is that what makes us human is not a set of capacities. No list of capacities says what it is to be human. What it is to be human is to interact with one another in a certain way. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of participating in a certain kind of life together. That's what being human is about. And don't give me any list. You know, if that's what you want from me, I can't help you. Okay? And so Jeff McMahon turns to me, and I say something like, you know, I can love my cake. I can dote on my cake. But it'll be a completely different thing for any kind of relationship to my daughter. And so Jeff McMahon turns to me in the most condescending way imaginable and says to me, look, Eva, we're not denying that you have a special relationship to your daughter. We're asking, why does anyone else have any obligations to your daughter? So, I didn't quite answer the question at the time, but I want to tell you the answer that I sort of come up with. And, you know, being here, I want your help with this. But the answer I've sort of come up with is that what it means for her to be my daughter, and he acknowledged that being a daughter is different than being a pet with an owner, okay? That's a different kind of relationship. I want to say, what does a mother want for a child? How does a mother feel the responsibilities to care for a child? Whatever that is, I need that for my daughter as much as anyone needs that for their child. And no one can do that by themselves. You need a community. You need exterior support. You need societal support. No one raises a child alone. Living in an intentional community, you have lived this in a very special way. And what I want from my child is not just that someone respect her because she's my child. Right? That's not what we want for our child. What we want for our child is that she be respected in and of herself. We get to that through the relationship. But in the end, it's the person themselves that has to be respected and treated with dignity. And that's what every mother wants for their child. And we are all some mother's child that deserves that kind of treatment.